The great hall settled into its deepest quiet as the last echo of midnight's chimes faded from the castle's ancient stones. Moonlight streamed through the enchanted ceiling, casting silver pools across the empty house tables where only hours before hundreds of students had shared their evening meal. The floating candles had dimmed to a gentle amber glow, their flames dancing lazily in the still air like drowsy fireflies. Sir Nicholas de Mimsey Porpington drifted through the oak doors with his characteristic glide, his nearly severed head tilting at that familiar, slightly precarious angle. The pearl-white ghost paused at the threshold, taking in the peaceful grandeur of the hall. Even after 5 centuries of such nights, the sight still filled him with a profound sense of belonging. This was his time, the quiet hours when Hogwarts belonged not to the living, but to those who had chosen never to leave. Punctual as always, Nick, came a soft, melodious voice from the shadows near the Ravenclaw table. The Grey Lady materialized from behind one of the great stone pillars, her form shimmering like moonlight on water. Helena Ravenclaw moved with the grace she had possessed in life, though now that elegance was touched with the ethereal quality of centuries spent in contemplation. Her long hair flowed behind her like silk, and her medieval robes rustled with a sound like distant wind through autumn leaves. "Helena, my dear," Nick replied, executing a courtly bow that nearly caused his head to slip entirely from his shoulders. He caught it with practiced ease, adjusting it back into place with the nonchalant air of someone who had performed this particular maneuver thousands of times, though I must say, punctual suggests I had a choice in the matter. You know how the castle calls to us at this hour. Indeed, there was something about midnight at Hogwarts that drew its spectral residents like a gentle summons. Perhaps it was the way the ancient magic settled into the stones, or how the portraits dozed fitfully in their frames, their painted inhabitants murmuring soft dreams. Whatever the cause, the 3 house ghosts had been meeting like this for longer than most could remember. "Where's our jovial friend?" Helena asked, glancing toward the great doors. As if summoned by her words, a rotund figure came bobbing through the wall near the staff table, his monk's robes billowing around him like a cheerful cloud. The fat friar's arrival always brought warmth to their gatherings. His round face beamed with perpetual good humor, and even in death, he seemed to radiate the kind of contentment that came from a life well lived in service to others. Tiny wisps of what might once have been incense smoke curled around his form, carrying the faint scent of herbs and baking bread. "My apologies, dear friends," the friar said, his voice carrying the slight wheeze of someone who had spent many years laughing often and well. Young Penelope Clearwater was having trouble sleeping again. Poor thing was tossing about something dreadful. I lingered in the Ravenclaw dormitory until she settled. Helena's expression softened with understanding. The living often forgot that the ghosts of Hogwarts were not mere spectral decorations haunting the halls for dramatic effect. They were the castle's memory made manifest, eternal guardians who had chosen to remain because they loved this place and its people too much to pass on. "The first weeks are always the hardest," she murmured. "I remember when I was alive, those September nights when the castle felt too vast, too full of strangers." Nick nodded sagely, his head wobbling slightly with the motion. "Though I suspect our dear friar's presence helped more than he knows. You've always had a gift for bringing peace to troubled minds. The three ghosts began their customary drift through the great hall, moving in the comfortable rhythm of old friends who had shared countless such wanderings. They passed between the long tables, their translucent forms catching and reflecting the candlelight in patterns that would have been beautiful had there been anyone awake to witness them. The harvest feast was particularly splendid this year, the friar observed, running an incorporeal hand along the Hufflepuff table where crumbs from the evening's treacle tart still dotted the wooden surface. Though I do worry about young Neville Longbottom. He barely touched his pudding, and you know how fond Hufflepuffs are of their desserts. Anxiety, I suspect. Those potions classes with Professor Snape would give anyone indigestion. Speaking of our dungeon-dwelling colleagues, Nick said with a wry smile, I noticed the Bloody Baron was particularly brooding this evening, more so than usual, if such a thing is possible. He spent the entire feast hovering near the Slytherin table, rattling his chains in a most melancholy fashion. Helena's silvery form seemed to dim slightly. The relationship between the house ghosts was complex, coloured by centuries of shared existence and the echoes of their mortal lives. The Bloody Baron's eternal torment over his actions in life, particularly his role in her own death, remained a source of gentle sorrow for all of them. He spoke to me briefly after the students retired, she said quietly. He asked if I thought forgiveness could truly be achieved through centuries of remorse. I told him what I always tell him, that forgiveness must first come from within. The friar's expression grew thoughtful. Heavy matters for such a peaceful night. Perhaps we might focus on lighter memories this evening? I find that dwelling too long on our regrets can make even eternity feel burdensome. They had reached the far end of the hall where the great windows looked out over the moonlit grounds. The whomping willow stood perfectly still in the distance, its branches creating intricate shadow patterns on the silver grass. Beyond it, the forbidden forest stretched dark and mysterious, home to creatures both wonderful and dangerous. Nick paused at one of the windows, his pearlescent form reflecting ghostly in the glass. Do you know what I find most remarkable about this place? He mused. After all these centuries, after all the changes, new students, different teachers, various crises and celebrations, the heart of Hogwarts remains constant. The desire to learn, to grow, to find one's place in the world, and to find one's family, added the friar softly. I've watched thousands of children arrive here, frightened and homesick, and leave as young adults with bonds stronger than blood. Houses become homes, classmates become siblings. Helena nodded, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of observation. We are witnesses to that transformation, aren't we? Generation after generation of children becoming the witches and wizards they were meant to be. A soft sound from one of the portraits interrupted their conversation. Sir Cadogan was muttering in his sleep, his painted sword slipping from his grasp as he dozed in his frame. The round knight had clearly had another evening of regaling the other portraits with tales of his dubious chivalric exploits. Even our painted friends need their rest. Nick chuckled, adjusting his ruff with careful fingers. Though I suspect Sir Cadogan's dreams are filled with dragons, he never actually fought, and maidens he never successfully rescued. The fat friar moved closer to examine the sleeping portrait. There's something rather touching about it, though. Even in paint and varnish, the desire to be heroic persists, to matter, to make a difference. Is that not what we all seek? Helena asked, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of philosophical contemplation. Living or dead, painted or corporeal, we all wish to know that our existence has meaning. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft, scuffling sound from the direction of the entrance hall. The three ghosts exchanged glances, their spectral senses alert to any disturbance in their domain's peaceful rhythm. "Someone's awake," Nick whispered, though his voice carried no real concern. Students occasionally wandered the halls at night for various reasons: nightmares, homesickness, or simple curiosity about their new home. The friar was already moving toward the sound, his generous spirit unable to ignore anyone who might need assistance, perhaps another young one having trouble sleeping. The castle can seem rather overwhelming in the dark hours. They followed the sound through the great doors and into the entrance hall, where moonlight streamed through the high windows, creating a checkerboard of light and shadow on the stone floor. The marble staircase rose before them in majestic spirals, each step worn smooth by countless feet over the centuries. "There," Helena pointed with one graceful, translucent finger. Third floor landing. A small figure in pajamas and a dressing gown was sitting on the steps, knees drawn up to chest, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The child couldn't be more than 11 or 12, clearly a first year overwhelmed by the magnitude of their new world. The three ghosts exchanged meaningful looks. This was exactly the sort of situation that drew them together night after night, not the grand adventures or dramatic conflicts that filled the history books, but the small human moments when someone needed comfort. "Shall we?" the friar asked, though they all knew the answer. As they began to glide up the marble stairs, Nick reflected on how many such encounters they had shared over the centuries. Countless homesick children, anxious students facing exams, young people struggling with the complexities of growing up in a world of magic. They were Hogwarts' unofficial counselors, its gentle guardians who worked their quiet magic in the deep hours of the night. The child on the stairs looked up as they approached, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The three ghosts arranged themselves at a respectful distance, their forms glowing softly in the moonlight. "Now then, little one," the friar said in his gentlest voice, "what brings you to our marble halls at such an hour?" The adventure was beginning, as it did every night at Hogwarts, not with grand pronouncements or dramatic revelations, but with simple kindness offered to someone in need. And as the three ghosts settled in to listen to another story of homesickness and adjustment, the castle itself seemed to lean in closer, its ancient stones holding the warmth of countless such encounters. In a few hours, dawn would come, and the living world would reclaim Hogwarts with its bustle of students and lessons. But for now, in the quiet magic of midnight, the castle belonged to its eternal guardians and the gentle mysteries they helped unfold, one lonely child at a time. The Grey Lady smiled, a rare, beautiful expression that transformed her ethereal features, and prepared to share the wisdom of centuries with someone who needed it most. The young Gryffindor, first year, a girl named Emma Thornfield, had finally stopped crying, though her breath still came in occasional hiccups. She sat on the marble step between Helena and the fat friar, while Nick hovered nearby, his pearlescent form catching the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. The child's wide eyes moved between the three ghosts with the mixture of awe and apprehension that most new students showed when encountering Hogwarts' spectral residence for the first time. "I miss my mum," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast entrance hall, "and my cat, Whiskers, and my bedroom at home, where I could see the garden from my window." The fat friar made a soft, sympathetic sound. "Gardens are precious things, dear child. They connect us to the cycles of life, to growing and nurturing. Tell us about yours." As Emma began to describe her mother's rose garden in halting, homesick tones, Nick found his thoughts drifting to his own memories of gardens, particularly one that had changed the entire course of his existence. He floated a little higher, positioning himself where the moonlight would catch his form most dramatically, a habit left over from his living days when he had been rather fond of theatrical gestures. "You know, young Emma," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of medieval nobility, "I once knew a garden rather well myself. And if I may say so, it was the site of both my greatest romantic disaster and, peculiarly enough, the reason I ended up losing my head." He paused, catching his head as it threatened to slide sideways. "Quite literally, as it happens." Helena raised an ethereal eyebrow. "Nick, are you certain this is an appropriate tale for—" "Oh, but it's a perfectly suitable story," Nick protested, his head wobbling with enthusiasm. "Educational, even. A cautionary tale about the perils of showing off, with just enough romance to be interesting and enough comedy to prevent nightmares. Besides," he added with a theatrical whisper, "it might help our young friend here understand that even the most embarrassing moments can become rather amusing, given enough time." Emma had stopped sniffling and was looking at Nick with growing curiosity. "You really lost your head? I mean, I can see it's nearly off. But how did that happen?" "Ah," Nick exclaimed, clearly delighted to have captured the child's attention. "Well, it begins, as all the best romantic catastrophes do, in a beautiful garden on a perfect summer day in 1492. He began to drift in slow circles around the little group, his ghostly form leaving trails of silvery light in the air. The fat friar settled more comfortably on his step, recognizing the signs of one of Nick's longer storytelling sessions, while Helena listened with the patient expression of someone who had heard this tale many times, but still found it entertaining. "I was Sir Nicholas de Mimsey, Porpington in those days," Nick began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "A young man of considerable charm, if I may say so myself, though perhaps lacking in common sense. I had been invited to the estate of Lord Wetherby for his daughter's 18th birthday celebration. Lady Grieve was her name, and she was considered the most beautiful young woman in 3 counties. Emma leaned forward slightly, drawn into the story despite her homesickness. "Were you in love with her?" "Desperately," Nick admitted with a rueful smile. The sort of all-consuming infatuation that makes young men do remarkably stupid things. Lady Grieve had hair like spun gold, eyes the color of spring violets, and a laugh that could make even the most sensible gentleman forget his own name. I was neither the richest nor the most handsome of her suitors, but I was determined to win her heart through the sheer magnificence of my magical abilities." The fat friar chuckled softly. "Oh dear, Nick, please tell me you didn't attempt one of those elaborate courtship spells. Worse, Nick replied cheerfully. I decided to enchant her entire garden as a birthday surprise. Roses that would bloom in her favorite colors, fountains that would play her favorite melodies, pathways that would light up with fairy lights when she walked upon them. It was to be the most romantic, magical display anyone had ever witnessed. Helena shook her head, her long hair floating around her like mist. The ambition of young wizards never fails to astound me. What could possibly go wrong with attempting to enchant an entire garden? Everything, as it turned out, Nick said with good humor. You see, I had been practicing magic for only a few years, and my enthusiasm far exceeded my actual skill. But I was convinced that love would guide my wand and make up for any technical deficiencies. He paused in his floating to gesture dramatically, nearly losing his head again in the process. Emma giggled, the first sound of amusement she had made since they found her on the stairs. The party was magnificent, Nick continued. Lords and ladies from across the kingdom had come to celebrate, and the gardens were already beautiful without any magical enhancement. Lord Weatherby had employed the finest gardeners, and every flower bed was perfectly arranged, every hedge precisely trimmed. But I, in my infinite wisdom, decided it needed improving. What was the first thing that went wrong? Emma asked, now thoroughly engaged in the story. Nick's expression grew sheepish. Well, I began with the roses. Lady Grieve had mentioned that her favorite color was deep burgundy, so I cast a spell to turn all the white roses in the garden to that exact shade. The magic worked perfectly, too perfectly in fact. Not only did the white roses turn burgundy, but so did all the pink ones, the yellow ones, the coral ones. Within minutes, every single rose in the garden was the exact same shade of deep red. The fat friar was trying not to laugh. Oh my! I imagine the gardeners were not pleased. The head gardener looked as though he might faint, Nick admitted. 40 years of careful breeding and cultivation, and I had turned his prized collection into what appeared to be a sea of blood-red blooms. But Lady Grieve clapped her hands and declared it delightfully dramatic, so I pressed on with my modifications. Helena floated closer, her ethereal form shimmering with amusement. Please tell me you stopped there. Oh, but I was just getting started, Nick said with mock grandeur. Next, I decided to enchant the fountain in the center of the garden. It was a beautiful marble piece with cherubs and water nymphs, and I thought it would be romantic if it played Lady Grieve's favorite song whenever she approached. Emma's eyes were bright with anticipation. But something went wrong with that too. Catastrophically wrong, Nick confirmed. You see, I had never actually heard Lady Grieve's favorite song. I had merely heard her humming what I assumed was her favorite tune. So I enchanted the fountain to play that melody, only to discover that what she had been humming was not a romantic ballad at all. What was it? Emma asked, leaning forward eagerly. Nick's head tilted at an even more precarious angle as he grinned. It was a tavern drinking song, a rather bawdy one, as it happened. So there I was, at an elegant garden party, with a magnificent marble fountain suddenly bellowing out a song about ale and questionable romantic encounters. The lyrics were, well, let us simply say, they were not suitable for mixed company. Even Helena was smiling now, her usually solemn expression lightening with mirth. Oh, Nick, you poor romantic fool. The worst part, Nick continued, warming to his story, was that I couldn't figure out how to stop it. The fountain continued playing this increasingly inappropriate song at full volume while all the distinguished guests stared in horror. Lord Weatherby's elderly aunt nearly swooned into the rose bushes, which you'll remember were all now the colour of dried blood. Emma was giggling openly now, her homesickness momentarily forgotten in the face of Nick's theatrical mishap. "Did you try to fix it?" "Oh, I tried," Nick said ruefully. "But panic makes for poor spellcasting. In my desperation to silence the fountain, I accidentally enchanted it to play even louder. Then, in my attempts to fix that, I somehow caused it to begin spouting not water, but what appeared to be, well, let us call it liquid refreshment of an alcoholic nature." The fat friar was openly chuckling now. A fountain of ale at a nobleman's garden party. I can only imagine the chaos. The chaos was considerable, Nick confirmed. But I was not finished with my romantic gesture. Oh no, there was still the matter of the fairy lights along the pathways. I had envisioned a soft, romantic glow that would follow Lady Grieve's footsteps wherever she walked. Instead, Emma prompted, clearly enthralled despite herself. Instead, I created what can only be described as magical fireworks that exploded every time anyone took a step. Small explosions, mind you, but explosions nonetheless. Soon the garden was filled with distinguished lords and ladies, leaping about like startled rabbits, trying to avoid setting off more magical pyrotechnics with every footstep. Nick paused in his storytelling, floating down to Emma's eye level. His expression grew more thoughtful, though still tinged with amusement at the memory. By this point, dear child, you might imagine that I would have admitted defeat and attempted to undo my magical improvements. But I was young and proud and thoroughly convinced that one more spell would set everything right. Helena made a soft sound that might have been either sympathy or exasperation. The final disaster, I assume. The final disaster indeed, Nick agreed. I decided that what the situation needed was a grand gesture to restore order and demonstrate my magical competence. So I attempted to cast a powerful charm that would return everything to its original state. Emma's eyes were wide, but it didn't work. It worked magnificently, Nick said with ironic cheer. Too magnificently. Not only did it reverse all my previous spells, but it reversed everything else magical in the garden as well. Protective charms, preservation spells, even the basic enchantments that kept the ornamental topiary in their carefully sculpted shapes. Oh no, Emma breathed. Oh yes, Nick confirmed. Within moments, the perfectly manicured hedges began growing wildly in all directions. The topiary animals, which had been charming peacocks and elegant swans, suddenly transformed into their natural, uncontrolled plant shapes, looking more like enormous green monsters. The garden paths, which had been magically maintained for decades, cracked and buckled as underlying roots broke free from their constraints. The fat friar was shaking his head in sympathetic dismay. And Lady Grieve? Nick's expression grew wistful. Lady Grieve took one look at the chaos, the fountains spouting ale, the exploding pathways, the hedge monsters, and her suitors fleeing in all directions. And she began to laugh. Not the delicate musical laugh I had fallen in love with, but great, hearty guffaws of genuine amusement. She wasn't angry, Emma asked. Furious might be more accurate, Nick admitted, but also thoroughly entertained. She told me later that it was the most memorable birthday party she had ever attended, though perhaps not for the reasons I had intended. Helena's ethereal form had moved closer to the window, where she gazed out at the moonlit grounds of Hogwarts. But surely, that wasn't what led to your unfortunate demise. No, Nick said, his tone growing more serious. That came later, when word of my magical disaster reached certain ears. You see, in those days, there were those who believed that any wizard who could cause such spectacular magical chaos must surely be practicing dark arts. Emma's expression sobered. They thought you were evil. They thought I was dangerous, Nick corrected gently. And in their fear, they decided that the safest course was to ensure I could never cast another spell. Hence, he gestured toward his nearly severed neck with rueful acceptance. But that's terrible, Emma exclaimed. You were just trying to do something nice for someone you cared about. Nick smiled at her indignation on his behalf. Indeed I was, dear child. And while the method was questionable, the intention was pure. Sometimes, our greatest disasters come from our most loving impulses. The fat friar leaned forward, his round face gentle in the moonlight. And sometimes, young Emma, our most embarrassing failures become our most treasured memories. Nick's story has brought comfort to countless homesick students over the centuries. But more importantly, Helena added softly, it reminds us that even when everything goes wrong, when we feel foolish, when we're far from home, when nothing seems to be working as we hoped, we can still find reasons to laugh. And laughter, even in the darkest moments, has a magic all its own. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the story and its gentle lessons. Finally, she looked up at Nick with new understanding. So even though you lost your head over a girl, literally, you can still smile about it. My dear child, Nick replied with theatrical grandeur, I prefer to think that I gave my heart so completely that losing my head was merely an inevitable consequence. And if that isn't romantic, I don't know what is. As Emma's laughter echoed through the entrance hall, mixing with the gentle chuckles of the three ghosts, Hogwarts itself seemed to settle more peacefully around them. Somewhere in the distance, a portrait murmured contentedly in its frame, and the ancient stones held the warmth of shared stories and gentle humor. The night was still young, and there were more tales to be told. Emma's laughter had faded to contented giggles, and the entrance hall had settled back into its peaceful midnight quiet. The young Gryffindor was sitting more comfortably now, her legs tucked beneath her dressing gown, no longer huddled in misery, but listening with the rapt attention of a child discovering that the world held more kindness than she had imagined. That was brilliant, Sir Nicholas, she said, using his proper name with the careful politeness of a well-raised child. Though I do feel rather sorry for Lady Greaves' garden. Nick preened slightly at the compliment, his nearly severed head wobbling with pleasure. Thank you, my dear. Though I suspect our good friar has stories that put my romantic disasters to shame when it comes to genuine kindness. The fat friar's round face creased into a warm smile, his form glowing more brightly in the moonlight. There was something about him that seemed to radiate contentment, as if even death had not diminished his fundamental joy in simply existing and helping others. Oh, I don't know about that, he said modestly, his voice carrying the gentle wheeze of someone who had spent many years laughing often and well. Though I suppose I do have a tale or two that might interest a young lady missing her home. Tell me, Emma, what did you love most about your house? Emma considered this carefully, her homesickness returning, but tempered now by the comfort of the ghost's presence. The kitchen, I think. Mum and I would bake together every Sunday after church. She taught me to make proper scones, and we'd sit at the big wooden table and plan the week ahead while they were cooling. The friar's expression grew infinitely tender. Ah, kitchens. There's no place more magical in any home, wizard or muggle. They're where love gets transformed into nourishment, where families gather to share not just food, but stories and dreams and the simple pleasure of being together. Helena had moved closer, her ethereal form catching the moonlight, as she settled gracefully beside Emma on the marble steps. The friar knows something about kitchens, dear one. Perhaps more than any of us. Indeed I do, the friar agreed, his eyes twinkling with memories spanning centuries. You see, before I became Hufflepuff's resident ghost, I spent many years tending to both the spiritual and physical needs of my village. And I discovered early on that the fastest way to a person's heart and the best way to help heal their troubles was through their stomach. Emma leaned forward with interest. Were you really a friar? Like, with a monastery and everything? Oh yes, child. Father Benedict they called me in those days, though I was never quite as austere as my fellow brothers would have preferred. His form flickered slightly with amusement. You see, I had rather revolutionary ideas about the nature of charitable work. I believed that helping people meant more than just praying for them. It meant feeding them, housing them, and occasionally bending a few ecclesiastical rules to ensure they were truly cared for. Nick floated closer, clearly enjoying the prospect of another tale. Do tell us about the Great Bread incident of 1463, dear friend. Emma would appreciate that particular example of your charitable flexibility. The friar chuckled, a sound like distant church bells mixed with the warmth of a well-tended hearth. Ah, you remember that, do you? Very well then. Emma, my dear, let me tell you about the winter when I learned that sometimes the most Christ-like thing one can do is to break a few monastery rules. He began to float in gentle circles around the little group, much as Nick had done during his storytelling. But where Nick's movements had been theatrical, the friars were soothing, like a parent walking a restless child to sleep. It was the worst winter our village had seen in living memory, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had told this story many times to comfort the troubled. Snow fell from October through March, and the cold was so bitter that even the strongest men struggled to keep their homes warm. The harvest had been poor that autumn, and by January, half the families in our village were facing genuine starvation. Emma's eyes were wide. That's terrible. What did you do? Well, that was the question, wasn't it? The friar replied thoughtfully. Our monastery had been blessed with a good harvest from our own lands. Our storerooms were full of grain, our pantries well stocked with preserved meats and vegetables. But you see, there were complications. Helena made a soft sound of understanding. Monastic rules about charity, precisely, the friar confirmed. Our abbot was a good man, but he believed firmly in following proper procedures. All charitable distributions had to be approved by the monastery's council, documented in triplicate, and distributed only to those who could prove their worthiness through appropriate penance and prayer. But people were starving, Emma said, her voice troubled. Indeed they were, child. And while the council debated the proper forms and procedures, children were crying themselves to sleep with empty bellies, and proud men were growing too weak to work, even when work could be found. The fat friar's expression grew more serious, though his fundamental kindness never wavered. So I made a decision that would have horrified my fellow brothers. I decided that the monastery kitchen would develop a peculiar problem with mice. Nick's head tilted with curiosity, threatening to slide completely off his shoulders. Mice. Oh yes, the friar said with a conspiratorial whisper that made Emma giggle despite the serious subject. Terrible, clever mice that would somehow manage to nibble holes in our grain sacks. And these miraculous rodents were remarkably considerate. They always nibbled the holes in exactly the right places to allow just enough grain to spill out and accidentally find its way into baskets that somehow ended up in the village square. You were stealing from your own monastery? Emma asked, her eyes bright with delight at the idea. Oh, I prefer to think of it as redirecting resources to their most urgent need, the friar replied with mock dignity. And really, I was simply being a good steward. After all, what use is grain sitting in a storehouse when there are hungry mouths in the village? Surely God intended food to be eaten, not hoarded. Helena was smiling now, her usually solemn expression lightened by the friar's gentle mischief. I imagine these mouse problems became quite extensive, remarkably so. The friar agreed cheerfully. And the strange thing was, these mice seemed to have very sophisticated tastes. They nibbled holes in the salt pork barrels, allowing just enough meat to spill out for proper stew making. They somehow managed to knock over jars of preserved vegetables, creating the most convenient accidents. They even, on one memorable occasion, appeared to have developed a taste for our honey stores. The children in the village must have loved that, Emma said, her homesickness temporarily forgotten in the warmth of the story. Oh, they did indeed. There's nothing quite like honey cakes to make a hard winter seem more bearable. And somehow, our monastery's beehives were producing far more honey than usual that year. Miraculous, really. The friar's expression grew more thoughtful as he continued his gentle floating. But the real magic happened in the kitchen itself. You see, I had discovered something wonderful. When people are fed, when their most basic needs are met, they become capable of extraordinary kindness themselves. What do you mean? Emma asked. Well, young widow Thompson, who had been struggling to feed her 3 little ones, suddenly found herself with enough grain to bake extra bread. And mysteriously, loaves began appearing on the doorsteps of other families who were struggling. Old Henrik, whose arthritis had prevented him from chopping enough wood for winter, discovered that his woodpile was somehow replenishing itself. Other villagers, now fed and strong enough to work, were quietly adding to his supply. Nick nodded approvingly, a cascade of kindness, as it were. Exactly, the friar exclaimed, his form brightening with remembered joy. The kitchen became the heart of something beautiful. Not just our monastery kitchen, but kitchens throughout the village. Women were sharing recipes and stretching ingredients to feed not just their own families, but their neighbors. Men were pooling resources to ensure everyone had fuel for cooking. Children were helping to deliver food to the elderly and infirm. Emma was leaning forward, completely absorbed in the story. But didn't the other monks notice that all this food was disappearing? The friar's eyes twinkled mischievously. Oh, they noticed. Brother Marcus, who was in charge of our stores, was quite convinced that we had the most destructive mice in all of Christendom. He spent hours examining the grain sacks, muttering about the intelligence of these particular rodents. Did you ever tell him the truth? Eventually, the friar admitted. When spring came and the crisis had passed, I confessed to the abbot what I had been doing. I expected to be severely punished, possibly even expelled from the order. Helena's ethereal form shimmered with curiosity. And were you? That's the remarkable part, the friar said softly. The abbot listened to my confession in complete silence. Then he asked me to walk with him through the village. We visited every home where my mice had provided assistance. We saw children who were healthy and strong, families who had not only survived the winter, but had grown closer through their shared struggles and mutual support. The fat friar paused in his floating, his expression growing distant with memory. When we returned to the monastery, the abbot called me into his chambers. I was certain my time as a monk was over. Instead, he appointed me as the official coordinator of all charitable works for our order. Really? Emma asked, delighted by this turn in the story. Really? He told me that my mice had accomplished more good than all our official charity committees combined. From that day forward, I was encouraged to find creative ways to help those in need, with full monastic approval. Nick applauded gently, the soft clapping sound echoing through the entrance hall. A happy ending then. Oh, but that's not the end of the story, the friar continued, his voice growing warmer still. You see, what I learned that winter changed everything about how I understood service and kindness. I realized that the most important ingredient in any kitchen, monastery, village home, or castle isn't the food itself. What is it then? Emma asked. Love, the friar replied simply. Love is what transforms grain into bread, what turns a simple meal into nourishment for both body and soul. Love is what makes a kitchen the heart of any home. He drifted closer to Emma, his gentle presence like a warm embrace. And that, my dear child, is why I spend so many of my nights checking on the kitchens here at Hogwarts. Not just the main kitchens where our wonderful house elves work their magic, but the smaller ones too. The private spaces where homesick students sometimes go to find comfort in familiar flavors. Emma's eyes widened with understanding. You help the house elves. Oh, we have a wonderful partnership, the friar said with genuine warmth. They handle the official meals magnificently, but sometimes a child needs something more personal. A cup of tea brewed just the way their grandmother made it, or biscuits that taste like home. The elves are always happy to accommodate such requests, especially when they come with a gentle suggestion from Hufflepuff's ghost. Is that why you were checking on that Ravenclaw girl earlier? Penelope? Precisely. She was missing her mother's chamomile tea. A simple thing, but sometimes simple things are the most important. A cup of properly brewed tea served at just the right temperature, with just enough honey. Well, that's a small miracle that can make a strange place feel a bit more like home. The fat friar's expression grew thoughtful as he continued. You know, in all my centuries here at Hogwarts, I've learned that the students who thrive are not necessarily the most magically gifted or the most academically brilliant. They're the ones who find ways to create home wherever they are. How do you do that? Emma asked, her voice small but hopeful. The same way my villagers did during that terrible winter, the friar replied gently. By caring for others, by sharing what you have, even if it's just a smile or a kind word, and by remembering that every kitchen, every common room, every corner of this castle where people gather in friendship becomes a little bit of home. He floated down to Emma's level, his kindly face glowing softly in the moonlight. Tomorrow, after breakfast, would you like me to show you something special? There's a small kitchen near the Hufflepuff common room where students sometimes go to make treats for friends. I think you might find it comforting. Emma nodded eagerly, her homesickness now mixed with genuine curiosity about her new school. Could I make scones, like the ones Mum taught me? I'm certain our house elves would be delighted to help you perfect your technique, the friar assured her. And perhaps you could make extra to share with other first years who might be missing home as well. As Emma smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd worn since they'd found her crying on the steps, the three ghosts exchanged satisfied glances. Another small victory in their endless mission of comfort and care. Somewhere in the distance, the castle's ancient clockwork chimed the half-hour, and a portrait murmured sleepily in its frame. The night was moving on, but there was still time for more stories, more gentle wisdom shared in the silver moonlight. And in the kitchens far below, the house elves working their quiet magic paused for a moment, sensing the fat friar's contentment floating down through the castle stones like a benediction. The ancient stones of Hogwarts seemed to pulse gently with the rhythm of sleeping hearts as the night deepened around the small gathering on the marble steps. Emma had grown quiet again, but it was a peaceful quiet now, the kind that comes after tears have been shed and comfort has been found. She sat nestled between Nick and the fat friar, while Helena, the grey lady, had positioned herself near the tall windows where moonlight could catch the ethereal beauty of her translucent form. Your stories have been wonderful, Emma said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast entrance hall. Sir Nicholas, your garden disaster was hilarious, and Father Benedict. She paused, looking uncertainly at the friar. Please, call me what the students do, the friar said with his gentle smile. The fat friar suits me perfectly well, and it reminds me not to take myself too seriously. Emma nodded gratefully. The fat friar's story about helping people made me feel hopeful, I suppose. Like maybe I can find ways to help others here even when I'm feeling lost myself. She turned to look at Helena, her young face, curious but respectful. But you haven't told us anything about yourself yet, my lady. Helena's expression flickered, a shadow of ancient pain crossing her beautiful, ethereal features, before settling back into its usual serene mask. She was quiet for so long that the others began to think she might not respond at all. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. My stories are more complicated than those of my dear friends, she said carefully. They are less about romantic follies or cheerful rule-breaking, and more about the heavy consequences of pride and the long, difficult path to forgiveness. Nick's nearly severed head tilted with gentle concern. Helena, my dear, you needn't burden young Emma with no. Helena interrupted softly, her silver eyes meeting Emma's with surprising directness. I think perhaps she should hear this. You see, child, you spoke of missing your mother, of the safety and love of home. My story is about what happens when we take such gifts for granted, and the wisdom that can come from losing them. She began to drift closer to the group, her medieval robes flowing around her, like mist made solid. As she moved, the moonlight seemed to follow her, creating patterns of silver and shadow on the marble floor. "I am Helena Ravenclaw," she said simply, "daughter of Rowena Ravenclaw, one of the 4 founders of this very school. This castle has been my home for over 1,000 years, first in life, then in death." Emma's eyes widened with awe. "You're one of the founders' daughters? That's incredible. You must have seen everything, the very beginning of Hogwarts itself." "Indeed I did," Helena replied, settling gracefully onto the steps near Emma. Despite being translucent, she somehow managed to give the impression of silk rustling and stones responding to her presence. "I watched my mother pour her heart, her genius, and her dreams into every stone of this place. Hogwarts was not just a school to her. It was a living testament to the belief that knowledge, wisdom, and learning could make the world a better place." The fat friar leaned forward slightly, his round face gentle with understanding. But being the child of someone so remarkable must have brought its own challenges. Helena's laugh was soft, but tinged with old sadness. "You understand perfectly, dear friar. Growing up as Rowena Ravenclaw's daughter was both a blessing and a burden I wasn't mature enough to appreciate. Every day I saw her brilliance, her dedication, her absolute certainty that education and wisdom were the highest callings, and every day I felt insufficient." "Insufficient?" Emma asked, her voice small. "But you must have been brilliant too. I mean, you're a Ravenclaw." "Intelligence, yes," Helena agreed. "I inherited my mother's quick mind and love of learning. But wisdom, that took much longer to acquire, and came at a price I would not wish on anyone." She paused, her ethereal form seeming to grow more translucent as painful memories surfaced. "You see, Emma, when you grow up in the shadow of someone truly great, it becomes easy to focus on what you lack rather than what you possess. Instead of appreciating my mother's love and guidance, I began to resent what I saw as her impossibly high expectations." Nick nodded understanding. "The burden of living up to a parent's legacy." "Exactly. And worse, I began to believe that I would never be enough, never be worthy of the Ravenclaw name. So I made a choice that would haunt me for centuries." Helena's voice grew quieter, forcing the others to lean in to hear her. "I decided to prove my worth by stealing my mother's greatest treasure." The entrance hall fell into complete silence. Even the portraits seemed to have stopped their gentle snoring, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. "What did you steal?" Emma whispered. "Her diadem," Helena replied simply. "A beautiful circlet that enhanced the wisdom of its wearer. It was her most prized possession, both for its magical properties and because it represented everything she believed about the pursuit of knowledge." The fat friar made a soft sound of sympathy. "Oh, my dear Helena, I told myself I was borrowing it," Helena continued, her voice steady but filled with ancient regret. "I convinced myself that if I could wear it, absorb its wisdom, I would finally become the daughter she deserved. I would return it once I had proven myself worthy of our family name." Emma was staring at Helena with a mixture of fascination and dawning horror. "But you didn't return it." "No," Helena confirmed, "because once I had taken it, I realized the magnitude of what I had done. I had betrayed the trust of the person who loved me most in the world. I had stolen not just an object, but a piece of my mother's very soul. So instead of facing her disappointment, her hurt, her anger, I ran. She stood abruptly, beginning to pace in slow circles around the group. Her movements were graceful but agitated, like a caged bird remembering the sky. I fled to Albania, to a forest where I thought I could hide forever. I wore the diadem, hoping it would grant me the wisdom to understand what I had done, the courage to make amends. But wisdom cannot be stolen, Emma. It must be earned through experience, through mistakes, through the humility that comes from acknowledging our failures. Did she come after you? Emma asked, her voice barely audible. Helena stopped pacing, her silver eyes reflecting centuries of pain. She sent someone. The Baron, who was then known simply as the Baron of Slytherin. He had feelings for me, though I had never encouraged them. My mother thought his devotion might convince me to return home. The mention of the bloody Baron made the other ghosts exchange meaningful glances. His eternal torment was well known to all of them, a source of both sympathy and sorrow. But I was too proud, too ashamed to face what I had done, Helena continued. When the Baron found me in that Albanian forest, I refused to return with him. I told him I would rather die than face my mother's disappointment. And in his anger, his desperate love, his own wounded pride. She paused, her form flickering with the intensity of the memory. He made that wish come true. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He struck me down in that forest, and immediately, consumed by horror at what he had done, he turned his blade on himself. We both died there, among the ancient trees, far from home and family, surrounded by nothing but our own failures and regrets. The silence that followed was profound. Even Nick, usually quick with a comforting word or gentle jest, seemed unable to speak. Finally, Emma found her voice. But you came back. You're both here, at Hogwarts. That must mean something, right? Helena smiled then, and for the first time since beginning her story, genuine warmth touched her ethereal features. You are wise beyond your years, young Emma. Yes, we returned. Both the Baron and I chose to remain here, rather than pass on, bound by our guilt and our love for this place. Do you hate him? The Baron, I mean, Emma asked, hesitantly. I hated him for many years, Helena admitted. Centuries, in fact. But hatred is a heavy burden to carry through eternity, and eventually I began to understand that his actions came from the same source as mine. Love twisted by pride, devotion corrupted by the inability to accept rejection or failure. She settled back down near Emma, her movements now more peaceful. The real tragedy, Emma, was not that we died in that forest. The real tragedy was that I never had the chance to apologize to my mother, to tell her that I understood finally what she had been trying to teach me all along. What was that? Emma asked softly. That wisdom is not something you can take from others or acquire through magical objects. It grows from within, through learning from mistakes, through accepting help from those who love us, through forgiving both others and ourselves. The fat friar leaned forward, his gentle presence radiating compassion. But surely, Helena, your mother would have forgiven you. Parents' love is not so easily broken. I believe she would have, Helena agreed, her voice growing stronger. In fact, I know she would have. You see, shortly before my death, she enchanted every portrait in the castle to carry a message. That she loved me, that she forgave me, and that she was waiting for me to come home. Emma's eyes filled with tears. But you never got to hear it. Not then, Helena said gently. But I hear it now, every night, when the portraits whisper their ancient memories to each other. Love, it seems, is the one magic that truly endures beyond death. She turned to face Emma fully, her silver eyes reflecting both ancient sorrow and hard-won peace. Would you like to know how I learned this lesson more fully? It happened just 3 years ago, right here in this very castle. Emma nodded eagerly, sensing that this part of the story might hold the hope she desperately needed. 2 Ravenclaw students had quarreled, Helena began, her voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller. Best friends since their first year, but something had come between them. Pride, jealousy, a misunderstanding that grew larger with each day they refused to speak to each other. What happened? One of them, a girl named Sarah, came to me one night, much as you did tonight. She was crying in the Ravenclaw common room, surrounded by bronze and blue, but feeling utterly alone. She told me about the fight, about how she missed her friend, but was too proud to apologize first. Helena's expression grew tender with the memory. I recognized myself in her story, Emma. The same pride, the same fear of vulnerability, the same stubborn refusal to take the first step toward healing. So I told her what I wish someone had told me centuries ago. What did you tell her? I told her that pride is a cold companion compared to friendship. That saying, "I'm sorry," is not a sign of weakness, but of love, and that the people who truly matter will forgive us, not because we are perfect, but because they understand that perfection is not what love requires. Emma leaned forward eagerly. Did she listen? She did, Helena replied, with satisfaction. The next morning, Sarah found her friend in the library and apologized. It turned out that Emma, her friend was also named Emma like you, had been equally miserable and equally too proud to make the first move. They reconciled immediately, and their friendship was stronger for having weathered that storm. That's a beautiful story, Emma said, wiping at her eyes. But that's not the end, Helena continued. You see, watching those 2 girls reconcile taught me something I hadn't learned in 1,000 years of regret. Forgiveness is not just about the past. It's about the present. Every day, we have opportunities to choose love over pride, connection over isolation, healing over old wounds. She reached out as if to touch Emma's face, though her ghostly fingers passed through without contact. That night, I found the Baron in the dungeons, where he usually broods over his chains and his guilt. And for the first time in centuries, I spoke to him not in anger or accusation, but with understanding. What did you say? I told him I forgave him. Helena said simply, not because what he did was right, but because carrying hatred was destroying us both. I told him that my mother's wisdom had finally reached me, that love is stronger than death, forgiveness more powerful than guilt, and that we could choose to let our tragedy become a source of healing rather than endless pain. Emma was crying openly now, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. Did he forgive himself? That is a longer journey, Helena admitted. But he has begun it. And more importantly, we have both begun to use our story to help living students understand the precious nature of the relationships they have now. Nick, who had been listening in thoughtful silence, finally spoke. And that young Emma is perhaps the most important lesson any of us can learn. Our mistakes, even our worst failures, need not define us forever. They can become the foundation for wisdom, compassion, and service to others. Helena nodded gratefully at her fellow ghost. Exactly. So you see, dear child, when you speak of missing your mother, of feeling lost in this new place, I understand. But I also want you to know that you have something I threw away in my foolish pride. Time. Time to appreciate the love you have. Time to build new relationships. Time to become the person you were meant to be. Emma wiped her tears on her dressing gown sleeve. Thank you for telling me that story. I know it must have been hard to share something so personal. Pain shared is pain lessened, Helena replied gently, and wisdom shared is wisdom doubled. If my story helps even one student avoid the mistakes of pride and stubborn independence, then perhaps my centuries of regret have served a purpose. The fat friar beamed at his fellow ghost with obvious affection. And that, my dear Helena, is why you are truly worthy of your mother's name. Not because you are perfect, but because you have learned to transform pain into compassion. As the four of them sat in comfortable silence, the ancient castle around them seemed to pulse with approval. Somewhere in the distance, a portrait murmured contentedly in its frame, and the very stones seemed to hold the warmth of reconciliation and hope. The night was moving toward dawn, but there was still time for more stories, more gentle wisdom shared in the silver moonlight. And in Emma's heart, homesickness was slowly being replaced by something stronger, the beginning of belonging. The first hint of dawn was still hours away, but something had shifted in the castle's rhythm. The three ghosts and young Emma had settled into a comfortable circle on the marble steps, their conversation having woven a cocoon of warmth and understanding around them. Emma's tears had dried, replaced by the quiet contentment that comes from being truly heard and understood. I feel much better now, Emma said softly, tucking her legs more securely under her dressing gown. Your stories have made me realize that everyone struggles sometimes, even people who've had centuries to figure things out. Nick chuckled, his nearly severed head wobbling with amusement. Oh, my dear child, if you think centuries provide clarity, you clearly haven't met many ghosts. We're just as capable of making spectacular mistakes as anyone else. We simply have longer to regret them. Though we also have longer to learn from them, Helena added with a gentle smile. And speaking of learning, I believe we may have an opportunity to put our accumulated wisdom to practical use. She had turned toward the corridor that led to the moving staircases, her ethereal senses apparently detecting something the others had not yet noticed. The fat friar followed her gaze, his round face creasing with concern. Another student? He asked quietly. I'm not certain, Helena replied, her voice thoughtful. But something is stirring in the portrait network. Can you feel it? The paintings are more restless than usual tonight. As if summoned by her words, a soft commotion began to emanate from the various portraits lining the entrance hall. The painted figures, who had been dozing peacefully in their frames, were beginning to stir and whisper among themselves. Sir Cadogan, the rotund knight who had been snoring loudly in his frame near the great doors, suddenly sat up with a clatter of painted armor. What's this then? He demanded in his usual bombastic tone, though he kept his voice low out of respect for the sleeping students. Something's got the portrait network all aflutter, messages flying back and forth faster than arrows at Agincourt. The fat lady, whose portrait hung near the corridor leading to Gryffindor Tower, had awakened as well. Her usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by an expression of motherly concern as she leaned forward in her frame. "It's young Timothy Wickham," she called softly to the ghosts. "First-year Hufflepuff, poor lamb. He's been crying in empty classrooms again. Violet from the third-floor corridor spotted him about an hour ago, wandering the halls in his pajamas." Emma looked up with immediate interest and sympathy. "Another homesick student?" "It appears so," Helena confirmed, rising gracefully from the steps. The Portrait Network serves as Hogwarts' early warning system for students in distress. When a child is genuinely struggling, the painted inhabitants spread the word, hoping someone will intervene. Nick floated higher, his form brightening with purpose. "Well then, it seems our night's work is not yet finished. Shall we investigate?" "Oh, could we?" Emma asked eagerly, scrambling to her feet. "I mean, I know I'm just a student, but maybe I could help somehow. Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone your own age." The three ghosts exchanged meaningful glances. The child's transformation from miserable homesickness to genuine concern for a fellow student was exactly the kind of magic Hogwarts was designed to foster. "I think that's an excellent idea," the fat friar said warmly. "After all, who better to comfort a homesick first year than another first year who has just discovered that such feelings are perfectly normal?" As they began to move through the entrance hall, more portraits joined the conversation. A stern-looking wizard in Tudor dress called down from his frame near the marble staircase. "Last seen heading toward the Transfiguration classroom," he reported crisply. "Young Wickham has been particularly troubled since receiving his first letter from home yesterday. Apparently, his little sister sent him a drawing, and it rather set him off." "Oh, the poor dear," murmured a kind-faced witch in medieval robes. "I remember my first weeks away from home. Every letter was both a blessing and a curse. Wonderful to receive, but it made the distance feel even greater." Emma nodded, understanding, as they climbed the marble staircase. "I got a letter from Mum yesterday too. She told me about Whiskers sleeping on my bed every night, waiting for me to come home. It made me happy and sad at the same time. The bittersweet nature of love," Helena observed gently. "Connection across distance brings both comfort and longing." They reached the second-floor landing, where a portrait of three medieval ladies was buzzing with quiet excitement. The ladies were known throughout the castle for their comprehensive knowledge of student affairs. They missed nothing and forgot less. "We've been tracking his progress," the First Lady announced importantly. "He went from the Transfiguration classroom to the Charms corridor, then doubled back toward the library." "But he's not in the library," added the Second Lady. "Madame Pince's portrait would have mentioned it. She keeps careful watch over nighttime wanderers." The Third Lady leaned forward conspiratorially. "We suspect he's found one of those little alcoves near the arithmancy classroom. You know the ones, tucked away where a child might think he won't be found." Nick nodded approvingly. "Excellent intelligence work, ladies. Though I do hope young Timothy realizes that in a castle full of portraits, true solitude is rather impossible to achieve." "That's rather comforting, actually," Emma said as they continued up the stairs. "I mean, it would be terrible to think that someone could be completely alone and unnoticed here." "Never alone at Hogwarts," the fat friar confirmed cheerfully. Between the ghosts, the portraits, the house elves, and the castle's own protective instincts, Every student is watched over by someone. They had reached the 3rd floor, where the portrait network's intelligence proved accurate. Soft sniffling sounds were indeed coming from a small alcove near the arithmancy classroom, tucked behind a tapestry depicting dancing trolls in tutus, a piece of decor that had always baffled everyone, including the portraits. Emma approached first, her small form less intimidating than the 3 glowing ghosts. She peered around the tapestry to find a boy about her own age, huddled in the corner, clutching a piece of parchment that was clearly stained with tears. "Timothy," she said softly. "My name's Emma. I'm a first year too, Gryffindor. Are you all right?" The boy looked up with red-rimmed eyes, clearly startled to be discovered. He was a typical Hufflepuff in appearance, round-faced, with sandy hair and kind eyes that were currently swimming with misery. "How did you know my name?" he asked, wiping his nose on his pajama sleeve. "The portraits told us," Emma explained, settling down beside him without waiting for permission. "They've been worried about you wandering the halls." "We have too." "We?" Timothy asked, then gasped as the 3 ghosts materialized more visibly in the narrow alcove space. "Don't be frightened, dear boy," the fat friar said gently. "We're Hogwarts' nighttime comfort committee, you might say. Whenever a student needs help, we try to provide it." Timothy stared at them in wonder. "You're the house ghosts, aren't you? I've seen you in the Great Hall, but I never thought. I didn't know you actually talk to students." "Oh, we do much more than talk," Nick said, with theatrical flair. "We listen, we advise, we share embarrassing stories from our own past to make troubled students feel better about their current situations." Despite his misery, Timothy almost smiled. "Really? Really," Helena confirmed, her ethereal form settling gracefully nearby. "In fact, we've just spent several hours helping Emma work through her own homesickness. Sometimes, the best cure for loneliness is discovering that you're not alone in feeling lonely." Timothy looked at Emma with surprise. "You were homesick too?" "Terribly," Emma admitted. "I was crying on the stairs in the entrance hall, missing my mum and my cat and my bedroom at home. But these 3 have been telling me stories and helping me understand that missing home doesn't mean I can't make a new home here too." Timothy held up the tear-stained parchment. "My little sister Lucy drew me a picture of our garden. She's only 6, and she wanted to show me how the sunflowers we planted together are growing. But looking at it just made me realize how much I'm missing. Lucy's learning to read, and I won't be there to help her. The sunflowers will bloom and go to seed, and I'll miss the whole cycle." The fat friar moved closer, his warm presence radiating understanding. "May I see the picture, Timothy?" Timothy handed over the parchment, which indeed showed a charming child's drawing of enormous yellow sunflowers towering over a tiny house. Stick figures labeled Lucy and Timothy stood among the flowers, holding hands and smiling. "This is beautiful," the friar said genuinely. "Your sister clearly loves you very much. And you know what I see when I look at this picture?" "What?" Timothy asked, his voice small. "I see a boy who taught his little sister to plant sunflowers, which means he taught her that beautiful things take time and patience to grow. Even though you're not there to watch these particular flowers bloom, the lesson you gave her will bloom in her heart all her life." Helena leaned forward, her silver eyes reflecting centuries of wisdom. "And consider this, Timothy. Every letter, every drawing, every small gift from home is proof that distance cannot diminish love. Your sister drew this picture because you matter to her, because your absence is felt and your presence is treasured. But I'm missing everything, Timothy protested. Lucy's first day of school, the harvest festival, even just the simple things like reading bedtime stories together. You're not missing everything, Emma said quietly. You're just experiencing different things. And when you go home for Christmas, you'll have stories to tell Lucy about this magical place. You can teach her things she never would have learned otherwise. Nick nodded approvingly. Wise words from our young Gryffindor. Tell me, Timothy, have you made any friends here yet? Timothy shrugged miserably. A few, I suppose. My roommates are nice enough. And there's a girl in herbology who helped me identify a dittany plant yesterday. Those are the beginnings of friendship, the fat friar observed. And friendship, Timothy, is how we expand our definition of home. Your sister will always be special to you, but that doesn't mean you can't develop other special relationships here. Have you told your doormates that you're feeling homesick? Emma asked. Timothy shook his head. I didn't want them to think I was a baby. Oh, my dear boy, Helena said with gentle exasperation. Do you really think you're the only first-year student missing home? I guarantee that at least half your classmates are experiencing exactly the same feelings. As if to prove her point, a portrait of a kindly-looking wizard further down the corridor cleared his throat politely. Excuse the interruption, he called softly, but I couldn't help overhearing. Young Timothy, I've been watching over this corridor for nearly 3 centuries, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that homesickness is as common among first-year students as getting lost on the moving staircases. Another portrait, this one showing a stern-faced witch, leaned out of her frame to add, just last week, I saw 4 different first years crying in various corners of the castle. It's perfectly normal, dear. The students who seem most confident are often the ones working hardest to hide their own fears. Timothy looked around at the gathering of ghosts, portraits, and fellow students with growing amazement. I had no idea anyone was paying attention. Hogwarts always pays attention, Nick assured him. The castle itself cares about its students. Why do you think the stairs sometimes rearrange themselves to help lost children find their way? Why do you suppose the house elves always know exactly what comfort food to serve when someone's having a particularly difficult day? Emma reached over and gently took Timothy's hand. And why do you think I was guided to find these 3 wonderful ghosts tonight, just when I needed them most? And why they were all here, ready to help us both? Timothy was quiet for a moment, absorbing this new perspective on his magical school. Finally, he looked up with something approaching hope in his eyes. So you really think it gets easier? I think it gets different, Helena replied thoughtfully. The missing doesn't disappear entirely, but it transforms. Instead of an ache that makes you feel disconnected from everything around you, it becomes a reminder of how much love you carry with you wherever you go. The fat friar beamed at his fellow ghost's wisdom. And in the meantime, there are practical things we can do to help. Timothy, would you be interested in visiting the kitchens tomorrow? I have an arrangement with the house elves. They're always happy to teach students how to make treats that taste like home. Could I learn to make Lucy's favorite biscuits? Timothy asked hopefully. I'm certain of it. And perhaps you could make extra to share with your doormates. Nothing builds friendships quite like fresh baked biscuits. Emma squeezed Timothy's hand encouragingly. And maybe we could be friends too. I mean, it might be nice to have someone who understands about missing home. Timothy smiled, the first genuine smile of the evening. I'd like that very much. As the small group began to make their way back toward the main corridors, the portrait network buzzed with quiet satisfaction. Mission accomplished. Another young soul guided back to hope and connection. You know, Timothy said as they walked, I was so focused on everything I was missing at home that I didn't think about all the new things I might discover here, like magical portraits that care about your well-being, Emma pointed out. And ghosts who tell embarrassing stories to cheer you up, Timothy added, grinning at Nick. And house elves who can teach you to bake, the fat friar added cheerfully. And the discovery, Helena said softly, that home is not just a place you leave behind, but something you carry within you and can create wherever you find kindness, understanding, and friendship. As they descended the marble staircase back toward the entrance hall, both children chattering quietly together and the three ghosts exchanging satisfied glances, the castle around them seemed to pulse with contentment. Another night, another small victory in the endless mission of turning a school into a home. The portrait network settled back into peaceful slumber, their nighttime vigil temporarily complete, but never truly ending. And somewhere in the distance, the first birds of dawn began to stir, though sunrise was still hours away. The little procession made its way through Hogwarts corridors with the quiet purpose of a midnight mission of mercy. Emma and Timothy walked side by side, their whispered conversation punctuated by occasional giggles as they discovered shared experiences. Both had gotten lost on their first day trying to find the Great Hall. Both had been intimidated by Professor Snape during their first potions lesson, and both had spent their first night crying into their pillows while trying not to wake their doormates. The three ghosts floated nearby, their ethereal forms casting gentle silver light on the stone walls. Nick had positioned himself as their scout, his centuries of wandering these halls making him expert at avoiding areas where Filch might be prowling or where Peeves might cause disruption. Helena drifted gracefully beside the children, her presence radiating the kind of calm wisdom that only comes from having truly learned from one's mistakes. The fat friar brought up the rear, his warm presence ensuring that no one felt alone or afraid in the vast castle. I can't believe I was sitting in that alcove, feeling sorry for myself when there's all this happening, Timothy said softly, gesturing at the portraits they passed. Each painted figure nodded encouragingly or whispered soft words of support as the group moved by. That's what homesickness does, Emma replied with newfound understanding. It makes you feel like you're the only person in the world who's ever felt that way. Like you're broken or weak for missing the people you love. But missing people means you've been loved, Helena observed gently. It means you've formed connections strong enough to cause pain when they're stretched by distance. That's not weakness. It's evidence of a heart capable of deep attachment. They had reached the main staircase, where the moving stairs had arranged themselves in what appeared to be their most helpful configuration. Nick floated ahead to test the route, his nearly severed head tilting as he listened for any sounds of approaching authority figures. Coast is clear, he reported cheerfully. Though I do believe the castle is actively assisting our mission. Notice how the stairs have positioned themselves to provide the most direct route to the kitchens. Indeed, the usually unpredictable staircases seem to have formed a clear path downward. Timothy looked around in wonder, beginning to understand that Hogwarts itself was more than just a building. It was a living entity that cared for its inhabitants. "The castle knows when students need help?" he asked. "Oh yes," the fat friar confirmed as they began their descent. Hogwarts has been home to countless young people over the centuries. It recognizes distress, loneliness, fear, and it responds by providing exactly what's needed. Whether that's a warm corridor when you're cold, a convenient shortcut when you're lost, or a comfortable alcove when you need somewhere to think. "But how does it know?" Emma asked, fascination overriding her earlier homesickness completely. "Magic," Helena replied simply, then smiled at the children's expectant expressions. "I know that seems like a non-answer, but truly, the deepest magic is often the simplest. Love, care, the desire to nurture and protect. These forces become embedded in places where they're consistently practiced. Hogwarts has been infused with such caring intentions for over 1,000 years. They had reached the entrance hall again, where their night's journey had begun hours earlier. The space looked different now, not empty and echoing, but somehow expectant, as if the castle was holding its breath in anticipation of the good work about to be done. "I feel different too," Timothy admitted as they crossed the familiar marble floor. "Not just because I'm not alone anymore, but because I understand something I didn't before." "What's that?" Nick asked, carefully adjusting his head as it threatened to slip sideways. "That being homesick doesn't mean I don't belong here. It just means I'm learning to belong in more than one place at once." Emma clapped her hands together softly, delighted by her new friend's insight. "That's exactly right. I was so worried that missing home meant I couldn't be happy here. But maybe it's possible to carry home with me and still make a new home too. Now you're beginning to understand one of life's most important lessons," Helena said approvingly. "The heart's capacity for belonging is infinite. We can love deeply in multiple places, treasure various relationships, and feel at home wherever we find kindness and acceptance." The fat friar had moved ahead toward a tapestry depicting a bowl of fruit, his round face bright with anticipation. "And speaking of finding kindness, my dear children, you're about to experience some of the warmest hospitality Hogwarts has to offer." He reached out to tickle the painted pair in the tapestry, which immediately began to squirm and giggle before transforming into a green door handle. The tapestry swung open to reveal the entrance to the Hogwarts kitchens, and immediately the most wonderful aromas wafted out: fresh bread, simmering soup, sweet pastries, and underneath it all, the comforting smell of a well-tended hearth. "The kitchens," Timothy breathed, his eyes wide with amazement. The room beyond was enormous, with gleaming copper pots hanging from hooks, multiple fireplaces crackling with welcoming flames, and long wooden tables where house elves were already at work preparing for the next day's meals. Despite the early hour, the kitchens buzzed with quiet activity, house elves kneading dough, stirring cauldrons, and arranging ingredients with the sort of loving care that turns simple cooking into nourishment for both body and soul. As the group entered, several house elves looked up from their work, their large eyes bright with recognition and pleasure. "Fat friar, sir," called a house elf, wearing a particularly crisp tea towel, like a toga. "And Nick, sir, and Grey Lady, miss. Welcome to kitchens. And these must be young students needing special care, yes?" "Indeed they are, Blinky," the fat friar replied warmly. "Emma and Timothy are both first years, both feeling the natural homesickness that comes with being away from family for the first time. I thought perhaps you might help them create some tastes of home." Blinky's face lit up with the sort of joy that only comes from being asked to do exactly what one loves best. "Oh yes, yes. House Elves is knowing all about making students feel at home. What foods is making young Emma and Timothy think of family?" Emma stepped forward shyly. "My mum and I make scones together every Sunday. They're not fancy, but they taste like safety, I suppose. Like everything being all right with the world. And my little sister Lucy loves these biscuits shaped like flowers," Timothy added. "Our grandmother's recipe. I was thinking if I could learn to make them, maybe I could send some to Lucy, or at least make them for friends here who might need cheering up." Blinky clapped his hands together with delight, and soon other house elves had gathered around, their enthusiasm infectious. Within moments, the kitchen had transformed into a bustling teaching center with ingredients appearing on the central table as if by magic, which Emma realized with wonder they probably had. "Scones is easy magic," announced a house elf named Pip, who wore a spotted tea towel and had flour already dusting her long fingers. "But secret is not in recipe. Secret is in love stirred into dough. And biscuits shaped like flowers is beautiful magic," added another elf called Dobble, whose enthusiasm was evident in the way he practically bounced as he gathered butter, sugar, and eggs. "But we is needing to know, what makes these treats special at home? What is making them taste like family?" Timothy thought carefully. "Grandmother always said the secret ingredient was the stories she told while we baked. She'd tell Lucy and me about when she was little, or about the flowers in her garden, or sometimes she'd make up fairy tales about the biscuit shapes we were cutting." Emma nodded, understanding. "And Mum always let me do the measuring, even when I made mistakes. She said cooking together was about more than getting everything perfect. It was about the time we spent together, just the two of us." The house elves exchanged meaningful glances, their large eyes bright with understanding. "Time and stories and patience," Blinky said wisely. "These is most important ingredients in any family recipe. We is teaching young students to cook, yes, but more important, we is teaching them to carry family love into new friendships." The fat friar beamed at the house elves' wisdom, "which is exactly why I knew you were the perfect teachers for these two young people. You understand that the real magic isn't in the cooking, it's in the caring." What followed was one of the most magical experiences either Emma or Timothy had ever had, and not just because they were in a wizard's kitchen surrounded by house elves. Pip guided Emma through making scones, but instead of simply following a recipe, she encouraged the girl to talk about her mother while she worked. "Tell Pip about Sunday mornings at home," Pip suggested as Emma measured flour. "What is making these times special?" Emma began hesitantly, but as her hands found the familiar rhythm of mixing ingredients, the words came more easily. She described the way morning lights slanted through her mother's kitchen window, how they'd discuss the week ahead, while waiting for the scones to rise, how her mother would always save the first one for Emma to eat while it was still warm from the oven. Meanwhile, Dobble was teaching Timothy the art of flower-shaped biscuits, but he too encouraged storytelling as an essential part of the process. Grandmother's stories is an important ingredient, Dobble insisted as Timothy rolled out dough. Maybe Timothy is telling stories to new biscuits, making them taste like home even in Castle Kitchen. Timothy found himself recounting some of his grandmother's favorite tales. Simple stories about brave little mice, kind dragons, and flowers that granted wishes to children who watered them faithfully. As he spoke, his hands grew more confident with the cookie cutters, creating delicate flower shapes that somehow seemed infused with the warmth of his memories. Nick, Helena, and the fat friar watched from nearby, their ghostly forms reflecting the golden light of the kitchen fires. Other house elves continued their own work, but they listened too, understanding that they were witnessing something important, the moment when two homesick children began to transform their longing into connection. "Look," Helena whispered to her fellow ghosts. "Do you see what's happening?" Indeed, something beautiful was taking place. As Emma worked, her scones began to smell not just like any scones, but specifically like the ones she'd made with her mother. As Timothy shaped his biscuits, they seemed to capture some essential quality of his grandmother's kitchen, some indefinable warmth that had nothing to do with the oven temperature. It's the stories, the fat friar observed with satisfaction. They're baking their love and memories right into the food. These aren't just scones and biscuits. They're edible connections to home. More house elves had gathered to watch and help, understanding instinctively that this was exactly the sort of work they lived for. As the baking progressed, other ingredients appeared on the table. Jam made from berries that grew wild on the Hogwarts grounds, honey from the castle's own beehives, butter churned fresh that very evening. "These is gifts from castle itself," Blinky explained as he arranged the additional treats on a large wooden tray. "Hogwarts is wanting to add its own welcome to family recipes." When the scones and biscuits finally emerged from the ovens, the kitchen filled with the most wonderful aroma, not just of baked goods, but of comfort, belonging, and love made tangible. Emma's scones looked exactly like the ones she'd made with her mother, but somehow they smelled even better, as if the castle's ancient magic had enhanced every familiar note. Timothy's flower-shaped biscuits were works of art, delicate and perfectly golden, each one carrying the echo of his grandmother's stories and his sister's delighted laughter. "Now comes best part," announced Pip, producing a large basket lined with a checkered cloth. "Young students are sharing their family magic with friends." "Sharing?" Emma asked. "Oh yes," Dobble confirmed, carefully arranging the warm scones and biscuits in the basket. "Food made with love is meant for sharing. Emma's scones and Timothy's flour biscuits is going to make other students feel welcome too." The fat friar's round face glowed with pride. "A midnight feast delivered by the ghosts and portraits to any student who might need a taste of home. We'll visit the common rooms, the dormitories, anywhere a young person might be lying awake missing their family." Helena moved closer to the basket, her ethereal form seeming to bless the contents with ancient wisdom. "And with each person who tastes these treats made with love, the circle of caring grows larger. Emma and Timothy's homesickness transforms into a gift that brings comfort to others. Nick floated up to examine the beautiful arrangements of baked goods. I do believe this is the most successful midnight mission we've undertaken in quite some time. 2 homesick children have become ambassadors of welcome for their fellow students. As the house elves packed additional baskets with leftover treats, enough to share with every first-year student in the castle. Emma and Timothy stood side by side, flour still dusting their hands, watching their small contribution being multiplied into something much larger. "I understand now," Timothy said softly. "Missing home doesn't have to make you smaller or sadder. It can make you bigger, more aware of when other people need comfort, more capable of providing it." Emma nodded, her earlier tears replaced by a glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with successful baking. "And sharing the love we've received makes us part of something larger than just our own families. It makes us part of the Hogwarts family too." The fat friar beamed at both children, his joy radiating warmth throughout the kitchen. And that, my dear young friends, is perhaps the most important lesson Hogwarts has to offer. We come here as individuals, but we leave as part of a community that extends far beyond these walls and lasts far beyond our school years. As the little group prepared to leave the kitchens, baskets in hand and hearts full of purpose, the house elves gathered to see them off. Each elf touched the baskets gently, adding their own blessings to the food within. "Go well, young students," Blinky called softly. "And remember, House Elves is always here when you is needing family comfort. Kitchens is always open to those who cook with love." The tapestry door swung shut behind them, but the warmth of the kitchen experience seemed to follow them into the corridor. Emma and Timothy walked differently now, not with the dejected shuffle of homesick children, but with the confident step of young people who had discovered their capacity to make others feel welcome. "Where shall we begin our deliveries?" Nick asked, adjusting his head and floating ahead to scout their route. "The first-year dormitories," Helena suggested. "I suspect we'll find several students lying awake, missing home and feeling alone." "Perfect," Emma said, hefting her share of the baskets with determination. "Let's go show them that no one has to feel alone at Hogwarts." As they began their journey through the sleeping castle, the portraits they passed smiled in their frames. The very stones seemed to pulse with approval, and somewhere in the distance, the first birds of dawn began to sing, though sunrise was still hours away. The night's work was far from over, but its purpose had crystallized into something beautiful, transforming individual loneliness into collective belonging, one carefully baked expression of love at a time. The mission of mercy had taken them through every corner of Hogwarts as the night wore on toward dawn. Emma and Timothy, their initial homesickness transformed into purposeful action, had become the most dedicated deliverers of midnight comfort the castle had ever seen. Under the gentle guidance of the 3 ghosts, they had visited dormitories, common rooms, and even discovered a few students in unexpected places, curled up in window seats, sitting alone in empty classrooms, or wandering corridors with the restless energy of those too troubled to sleep. Each encounter had been different, but all had been touched by the same gentle magic. A second-year Ravenclaw named Marcus, found crying over a letter from his ailing grandfather, had been offered warm scones and the wisdom of Helena's centuries. A tiny first-year Slytherin called Ophelia, discovered hiding in an alcove because she was afraid her doormates would mock her tears, had been comforted by Nick's theatrical stories and Timothy's understanding friendship. A group of homesick Hufflepuff students had gathered in their common room's kitchen nook, sharing memories of a home, and had welcomed Emma's scones as if they were messages from their own families. Now, as the first pale hints of dawn began to touch the eastern windows, the little group found themselves climbing the winding stairs of the astronomy tower. The baskets were empty, their contents distributed among dozens of grateful students throughout the castle. But more than food had been shared. Stories had been exchanged, friendships had been kindled, and the invisible network of care that made Hogwarts truly magical had been strengthened by countless small acts of kindness. "I can't believe how many students were awake," Emma said softly as they climbed, her voice filled with wonder rather than exhaustion. "I thought Timothy and I were the only ones struggling with homesickness." "Oh, my dear," Helena replied gently, her ethereal form gliding effortlessly up the spiral staircase. "One of the great discoveries of growing older, whether in life or death, is realizing how rarely our struggles are unique. What feels impossibly isolating to us is usually a common human experience, shared by more people than we could ever imagine." Timothy nodded earnestly, carrying the last empty basket. "That boy Marcus in Ravenclaw was so surprised when I told him I missed my sister. He said he thought he was childish for missing his grandfather so much. But there's nothing childish about love, is there?" The fat friar beamed with pride at the young Hufflepuff's insight. "Nothing at all, dear Timothy. In fact, I would argue that the capacity to love deeply, to maintain strong connections across distance and time, is one of the most mature and admirable qualities a person can possess." Nick floated ahead of them, his nearly severed head wobbling as he navigated the narrow stairwell. "And speaking of connections," he called back cheerfully, "wait until you see what our portrait friends have accomplished while we were on our rounds." They emerged onto the open platform of the astronomy tower to find it transformed. The usual collection of telescopes and star charts remained, but they had been joined by an extraordinary gathering. Portraits from throughout the castle had somehow arranged themselves to be visible from the tower. Some had temporarily moved into frames that faced the windows. Others had positioned themselves in doorways, and a few had even managed to appear in the glass surfaces of the telescopes themselves. Sir Cadogan waved his painted sword enthusiastically from a frame that had definitely not been there earlier in the evening. "Greetings, brave midnight adventurers. The Portrait Network has been following your noble quest all night." The fat lady, somehow visible in the polished surface of a large telescope, clapped her painted hands with delight. "You magnificent children have restored our faith in the next generation. Such kindness, such wisdom, such perfectly executed scone delivery." Emma and Timothy looked around in amazement at the assembled painted crowd, all of whom seemed to be beaming with approval. Even some portraits they hadn't met during the night were present. Stern-faced headmasters from centuries past, medieval ladies with knowing smiles, Tudor gentlemen with twinkling eyes, and countless others who had chosen to witness this moment of dawn and reflection. "But how did they all get here?" Emma asked, in wonder. "Portrait magic is quite flexible when the cause is worthy," Helena explained with a smile. "They can visit other frames, borrow space in reflective surfaces, even appear in pools of water if necessary. Tonight, they wanted to bear witness to what you've accomplished. And what exactly have we accomplished? Timothy asked, settling down on the tower's stone floor beside one of the telescopes. I mean, we just shared some baked goods with homesick students. It doesn't seem like such a big thing. The fat friar settled beside him, his warm presence radiating contentment. Oh, but it was a very big thing indeed, Timothy. You see, what you've done tonight is demonstrate one of the most important principles of magic. Not the kind that requires wands and incantations, but the deeper magic that runs through everything. What kind of magic is that? Emma asked, curling up beside Timothy and gazing out at the gradually lightening sky. The magic of transformation, Helena replied, moving to where she could look out over the Hogwarts grounds. You began this night as two isolated, homesick children, convinced that your sadness made you different from everyone else. You're ending it as young people who understand that shared sorrow becomes shared strength, and that the love we carry from home can be multiplied infinitely when we use it to care for others. Nick drifted closer to the group, positioning himself so that the growing light would catch his pearlescent form. And more than that, you've learned that belonging isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create through your choices, your kindness, your willingness to reach out to others who might be struggling. As if summoned by his words, the sounds of the waking castle began to drift up from below. House elves were lighting the morning fires. Early rising students were stirring in their dormitories. And somewhere in the distance, the faint clatter of breakfast preparation could be heard from the kitchens. Listen, the fat friar said softly, tilting his head toward these gentle sounds. Do you hear that? That's the sound of a community waking up to a new day. And because of what you've done tonight, dozens of students will wake feeling less alone, more connected, more capable of facing whatever challenges the day might bring. Emma was quiet for a moment, absorbing this perspective. I was so focused on what I was missing from home that I didn't think about what I could bring to this new place, she finally said. But sharing Mum's scone recipe with other students, it felt like I was introducing them to a piece of my family, like I was making my home bigger instead of feeling cut off from it. And Lucy's flour biscuits, Timothy added thoughtfully. They made that little Slytherin girl smile for the first time since she got to Hogwarts. Somehow, sharing my grandmother's recipes made me feel closer to both my family at home and my new friends here. Sir Cadogan waved his sword approvingly from his borrowed frame. Exactly right, young scholars. The bravest knights are those who transform their own pain into protection for others. The fat lady nodded sagely from her telescope reflection. And the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have learned to harmonize their own melodies with others. As the eastern sky continued to brighten, painting the clouds in shades of pearl and rose gold, more sounds joined the gentle symphony of the awakening castle. Owls returning from their nighttime hunts, roosters crowing from Hagrid's hut, and the distant splash of the giant squid in the lake. All the familiar sounds that marked the transition from night to day at Hogwarts. Helena had moved to the eastern window, her silver form catching and reflecting the growing light. You know, she said thoughtfully, I've watched thousands of sunrises from this tower over the centuries, but this one feels particularly significant. Why is that? Emma asked, moving to join her at the window. Because I'm seeing it through your eyes, Helena replied gently. Through the eyes of two young people who began this night believing they were outsiders and are ending it as full participants in the great work of making Hogwarts a home for everyone who enters these walls. Timothy joined them at the window, and together they watched as the sun began to peek over the distant mountains that surrounded the castle grounds. The light touched the forbidden forest first, turning the canopy of trees from black to deep green. Then it spilled across the lake, transforming the dark water into a mirror of liquid gold. Finally, it reached the castle itself, warming the ancient stones and setting the windows ablaze with reflected fire. It's beautiful, Timothy whispered. I've never watched the sun come up before. Not like this. Few people take time to witness the daily miracle of dawn, Nick observed, his nearly severed head tilting as he too watched the spectacle. But there's something profound about seeing darkness gradually transformed into light. It reminds us that even the longest, most difficult nights eventually give way to new possibilities. The fat friar had positioned himself near the group, his form glowing more brightly as the natural light increased. And speaking of new possibilities, my dear children, what do you think tomorrow night might bring? Will you return to feeling homesick and isolated, or have you perhaps discovered something more sustaining? Emma considered this seriously. I think I'll still miss home sometimes. Missing Mum and Whiskers doesn't just disappear. But now I know that missing them doesn't have to make me miserable. It can remind me how lucky I am to have people to miss. And it can help me recognize when other students need the same kind of care I received tonight. And I want to keep baking, Timothy added with growing excitement. Not just for homesick students, but maybe to celebrate good things too. When someone gets a good mark on a difficult exam, or makes the Quidditch team, or just needs cheering up on a rainy Tuesday. The portraits throughout the tower murmured their approval, and several medieval ladies applauded with painted hands. Those are wonderful intentions, Helena said warmly. But remember, the most important thing you've learned tonight isn't about what you can do for others, though that's certainly valuable. The most important thing is that you've discovered your own capacity to transform difficulty into wisdom, loneliness into connection, and homesickness into a deeper understanding of what home truly means. As the sun climbed higher, the castle below them was coming fully awake. Students were beginning to emerge from their dormitories, heading to the great hall for breakfast. From their high vantage point, Emma and Timothy could see tiny figures moving through the courtyards, early risers taking morning walks, older students heading to the owlery to send letters home, groups of friends gathering to start their day together. Look at all of them, Emma said with wonder. All those students, all starting their day, all probably carrying their own mixture of excitement and homesickness and hope. And now you understand, Nick said with satisfaction, that you're not separate from that community. You're part of it. Your struggles connect you to others rather than isolating you from them. The fat friar began to glow more softly as the natural light grew stronger. Which brings us to a gentle transition, dear children. Dawn is the time when we ghosts traditionally retreat to our quieter contemplations, allowing the living world to reclaim the castle for another day. But we'll see you again, won't we? Timothy asked with something approaching alarm. I mean, it changed everything for me. I'd hate to think this was just a one-time thing. Helena smiled, and her expression was radiant with affection. Oh dear Timothy, you'll see us every day in the Great Hall, of course, but more importantly, you'll carry what we've shared with you always. The next time you encounter a homesick student, you'll know exactly how to help. The next time you feel disconnected from home, you'll remember that love stretches across any distance. And the fat friar added with a conspiratorial whisper, the kitchen arrangement remains in place. Any time you want to bake something special for someone who needs comfort, Blinky and the other house elves will be delighted to assist. Emma looked around at the three ghosts who had transformed her night from misery to magic, her young face serious with the weight of gratitude. How do we thank you? How do we possibly thank you for everything you've given us? By passing it on, Nick replied simply. By remembering that every person you meet is carrying their own invisible struggles, and that small acts of kindness can transform someone's entire world. By becoming the sort of people who watch for students sitting alone, who notice when someone needs a friend, who understand that sharing our own vulnerabilities makes us stronger, not weaker. The portraits throughout the tower began to murmur their farewells, and several frames started to dim as their occupants prepared to return to their regular locations throughout the castle. Sir Cadogan saluted with his painted sword. The fat lady blew them kisses from her telescope reflection, and dozens of other painted faces smiled their blessing on the night's work. As the last of the portraits faded back to their usual posts, the four companions, 3 ghosts and 2 transformed students, stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun complete its emergence over the horizon. The world below was fully awake now, golden with morning light and alive with the promise of a new day. I should probably get back to my dormitory, Emma said eventually, though she made no move to leave. My roommates will wonder where I've been, and I should return to the Hufflepuff common room. Timothy agreed, equally reluctant to break the spell of the morning. But this has been the most important night of my life. I'm not the same person who was crying over my sister's drawing just hours ago. Helena drifted closer to both children, her eternal wisdom reflecting in her silver eyes. You're exactly the same person, Timothy. And so are you, Emma. The capacity for growth, for connection, for transforming pain into compassion has always been within you. Tonight simply provided the circumstances for those qualities to emerge. The fat friar beamed at both young people with paternal pride. And now you understand what we 3 have learned over our many centuries here, that Hogwarts' greatest magic isn't in its spells or potions, or even its ability to teach young wizards and witches to use their powers. Its greatest magic is in its capacity to transform strangers into family, to help frightened children discover their own courage, and to prove that no one ever has to face their struggles alone. Nick floated in a gentle circle around the group, his theatrical nature subdued by the solemnity of the moment. So when you return to your dormitories, when you join your housemates for breakfast, when you begin another day of classes and learning and all the ordinary challenges of school life, remember this. You are not the same students who arrived here weeks ago feeling lost and overwhelmed. You are young people who have discovered their own capacity for magic, the kind that has nothing to do with wands. Emma and Timothy exchanged a look of perfect understanding. They had found more than comfort this night. They had found their place in the great tapestry of Hogwarts life. "We should go," Emma said, finally, but her voice was peaceful rather than reluctant. "Yes," Timothy agreed, "but we'll see each other at breakfast. And maybe we can sit together, save seats for any other first years who look like they might need friends." As the two students headed toward the staircase, the three ghosts gathered near the eastern window, their forms growing more translucent as the morning light strengthened. They watched until Emma and Timothy disappeared down the winding stairs, their footsteps echoing with the confident rhythm of young people who had found their purpose. Another successful night, the Fat Friar observed with deep satisfaction. Indeed, Helena agreed, her eternal sorrow touched now with profound joy. 2 more students have learned that love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing. Nick adjusted his nearly severed head one final time, grinning at his fellow ghosts. And we've been reminded once again why we chose to remain here. Every homesick child who discovers they're not alone, every act of kindness that ripples out through the castle, every moment when strangers become friends, these are the reasons our existence continues to have meaning. As the sun climbed higher over Hogwarts, painting the ancient castle in shades of gold and rose, the 3 ghosts began their own gentle transition toward the quiet contemplation that filled their daylight hours. But they carried with them the satisfaction of another mission accomplished, another night when the castle's eternal promise had been fulfilled, that no student who truly needed help would ever be left to face their struggles alone. Far below, in the great hall, house elves were setting the tables for breakfast, their work made lighter by the knowledge that their midnight baking session had brought comfort to so many young hearts. And throughout the castle, dozens of students were waking to a new day, feeling more connected, more hopeful, and more certain of their place in the magical community that was Hogwarts. The night was ending, but its legacy would continue in countless small acts of kindness, in friendships forged over shared struggles, and in the eternal truth that home is not a place we leave behind, but a feeling we carry with us and can create wherever we find love, understanding, and the courage to care for one another. The secret lives of the Hogwarts ghosts continued, as they always had and always would, filled with purpose, touched by love, and dedicated to the endless joyful work of helping young hearts find their way home. And so our gentle journey through one transformative night at Hogwarts comes to its peaceful close. As dawn painted the ancient castle in shades of gold and rose, Emma and Timothy descended from the astronomy tower as different people than they had been just hours before. No longer isolated by homesickness, they had discovered the profound magic that happens when we transform our own struggles into compassion for others. The 3 house ghosts, Nearly Headless Nick, with his theatrical charm and romantic disasters, the Fat Friar with his endless capacity for nurturing care, and the Grey Lady with her hard-won wisdom about forgiveness and belonging, returned to their eternal vigil. But they carried with them the satisfaction of another night well spent, another mission of comfort successfully completed. In the days that followed, Emma and Timothy would indeed become ambassadors of welcome for their fellow students. The kitchen arrangement with the house elves flourished into a regular tradition, with homesick students learning to bake their family recipes while sharing the stories that made those foods special. The portrait network continued its watchful care, alerting the ghosts whenever a student needed the gentle intervention that only centuries of accumulated wisdom could provide. And through it all, Hogwarts itself pulsed with the ancient magic that had drawn 4 founders to create this sanctuary of learning. The understanding that true education happens not just in classrooms filled with spells and potions, but in quiet moments of connection, in midnight conversations that heal lonely hearts, and in the countless small acts of kindness that transform a school into a home. For this is the secret life that flows through Hogwarts after midnight, when the living world sleeps and the eternal guardians take their watch. It is a life built on the profound truth that no one need ever be truly alone, that love shared multiplies rather than diminishes, and that the deepest magic of all is the force that transforms strangers into family, homesickness into belonging, and individual struggles into collective strength. The castle keeps its secrets well during the daylight hours. Students hurry to classes, portraits doze in their frames, and the great stone walls hold their silence. But those who know where to look, who understand the significance of a house elf's knowing smile, a ghost's approving nod, or a portrait's conspiratorial wink, recognize the signs of the endless, gentle work that continues in shadows and silence. So the next time you find yourself feeling lost or lonely, remember Emma and Timothy's midnight journey. Remember that the capacity for belonging lives not in perfect circumstances or the absence of struggle, but in our willingness to reach out to others, to share our stories, and to transform our own pain into pathways for healing. And perhaps, if you listen carefully to the quiet spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the conscious and the dreaming, you might hear the gentle whisper of ancient stones and caring spirits reminding you of Hogwarts' eternal promise. You are never truly alone. Love travels any distance. Home is not a place you leave behind, but a feeling you carry forward and can create wherever you find kindness, understanding, and the courage to care. Rest well, dear reader. The ghosts are watching, the portraits are keeping vigil, and somewhere in the distance, house elves are preparing tomorrow's comfort, one loving gesture at a time. Sweet dreams, and welcome home.